Okay, so you want to own a ranch. And of every business we could look at, this is the one people want, for reasons that have almost nothing to do with money. Land, space, cattle moving across a pasture at first light, a gate you close behind you, something you can walk the boundary of. It is the most emotionally purchased asset in America, and that turns out to be the single most important fact about its economics. Two things to hold on to before we go anywhere. The first is that there is one number that tells you a ranch is not a cattle business, and it is not the price of beef. It is a number so small that when you see it next to the price of the land, your first instinct will be that somebody made a typing error. The second is stranger. American ranchers just came off the most profitable stretch in a generation. Record calf prices, record margins, and it made buying a ranch harder, not easier. Not because of interest rates, for a reason built directly into how the asset works. We will get to both, but we start with the cow, because everybody starts with the cow, and the cow is where the illusion lives. Here is the thesis, and everything else in this video is just the proof. A ranch is not a business that owns land. It is land that runs a business to justify owning it. Watch what happens when you actually run the cattle numbers, and watch how quickly the business turns out to be the smaller half of the story. The standard American operation is called cow-calf. You keep a herd of mother cows. They produce a calf each per year. You raise those calves on grass until weaning, and you sell them. That is the product, not beef. Weaned calves sold by the pound to somebody else who finishes them. So how much does one cow make you? The USDA estimated that in 2024, cow-calf operations brought in about $1,130 per cow in revenue, against roughly $691 in operating expenses. That leaves a net return above operating costs of somewhere around $439 per cow. $439 per cow per year. Now hold that number, because it immediately gets more complicated in both directions. First, it got much better. 2025 was extraordinary. The national beef herd has been contracting for years, which means fewer calves, which means buyers competing for a shrinking supply. The CattleFax Cow-Calf Survey reported average revenue of $2,246 per calf in 2025, a record, up over $600 from the prior year. Cash cow costs also hit a record at about $780 per head, but the price increase outran the cost increase, and margins expanded. That is what a genuinely great year looks like in this industry. Not a new product, not a clever strategy. The herd got smaller, and the price went up. But here is the second complication, and it is the one that quietly decides everything. Those figures are returns above operating costs. Operating costs are feed, veterinary, fuel, repairs, marketing, interest on operating loans. They are the things you spend to run the herd. They are not the things you spend to have a ranch. One estimate for the northern Great Plains put annual cow-calf operating costs around $950 per cow, with feed alone at $610. Then it put fixed costs at roughly $900 per cow on top, with labor being a major share. Fixed costs are your labor, your equipment depreciation, your fencing, your facilities, your machinery, your buildings, and your land. Once land and labor enter the calculation, the picture changes completely. A University of Kentucky budget for a well-managed spring calving herd estimated a return to land and labor of around $753 per cow at 2025 prices. That sounds strong until you read the phrase carefully. That is the money available to pay for land and labor. It is not profit. It is the pool that has to cover both before a single dollar becomes yours. So run it on an actual ranch. Say you have 200 mother cows. That is a real operation, not a hobby, not a corporate outfit, a working family ranch. At $750 per cow, in return to land and labor, you have about $150,000 a year to cover the land, the labor, the machinery, and yourself. And in a record year, that is genuinely good money. Now here is the question nobody asks first, and it is the whole video. How much land did you need to own to generate it? Stocking rate is the number of acres it takes to feed one cow for a year, and it varies enormously. Good pasture in Kentucky might run around 2 acres per cow. Move west into dry country, and the same cow might need 20, 30, or, in genuinely arid range, more. Take a moderate case, 10 acres per cow, 200 cows, that is 2,000 acres. Now, you could stop the video here, and you would already know more about cattle economics than most people who romanticize this life. Everything so far is just a herd budget, and herd budgets are the part ranchers actually talk about. The part that decides whether you can ever own one of these is something else entirely, and it is sitting underneath every one of those acres. Because now we go find the number I promised you at the start. In its most recent land value summary, the USDA put the average value of American pasture land at $2,000 per acre, up 4.2% from the year before. Pasture value has now risen in every state for years running, with the northern plains posting the largest gains. So your 2,000 acres of pasture is worth roughly $4 million. And here is the number. In the same national data, cash rent for pasture land averaged $16 per acre. $16 on an asset worth $2,000. That is a yield of 0.8%. Before property taxes, before maintenance, before a single dollar of fencing. Read it once more, slowly. You can own an acre of American pasture worth $2,000, and the going rate to let somebody else graze it for a year is $16. If you know somebody who talks about buying land and running some cattle on it, this is the number to send them. Not the calf price, this one. Because that ratio tells you something the entire industry knows and rarely says out loud. The market is not pricing this land based on what it produces. If it were, an acre generating $16 a year would not cost $2,000. The land is priced on something else entirely. Now, before I go on, I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a story about ranchers being fools or the market being broken. Neither is true. Ranching is real work, producing a real product that people eat. The operations are frequently well run by people who understand their costs far better than most business owners understand theirs. And plenty of ranch families make a genuine living. Nothing in this video says otherwise. What I am describing is not incompetence. It is a structural feature of an asset that two completely different kinds of buyer want for two completely different reasons. So let's look at the other reason. In 1970, American farm real estate averaged $196 per acre. In the most recent summary, it averaged $4,350 per acre, marking the fifth consecutive annual increase. Cropland reached $5,830 an acre, and pasture $1,920 before rising again the following year. Those are nominal figures, and inflation explains a chunk of it. But even adjusted, the direction is unmistakable, and it has been unmistakable for decades. So put the two things side by side, because this is the entire business. Your 2,000-acre ranch in a record cattle year throws off maybe $150,000 before you pay yourself and before you service any debt. That same 2,000 acres, appreciating at 4.2%, gained about $168,000 in value that year. The dirt out-earned the cattle, silently, without you doing anything, without a single calf being born. And notice something important about those two numbers. They are close. In a record year, the operating business roughly matches the appreciation. In an average year, it does not come close, which means a ranch has two financial statements telling two completely different stories about the same 12 months, and only one of them ever shows up in your bank account. The income statement says you worked all year for a modest return that would look thin against the capital employed. The balance sheet says you made $168,000 while you slept. The income statement pays for groceries. The balance sheet is the actual business. Now I can answer the second thing I promised you. Why the record profits made buying in harder, not easier. Because good years get capitalized into the price of the land. When calf prices go up and margins expand, the land that produces those calves becomes more valuable to anyone who wants to run cattle on it. Buyers bid the price up, so the operating profit, the thing you were hoping to earn, gets converted into an increase in the entry cost of the asset. You do not get to enjoy a great cattle market and buy in cheaply afterward. The great cattle market is the reason you cannot. And this is the mechanism that makes ranch ownership so difficult to enter and so difficult to leave. It is why the average American rancher is old, and why so much of this land transfers by inheritance rather than by sale. There is one more layer, and it is the one that finally explains that 0.8%. When you go to buy that ranch, you are not only bidding against other ranchers, you are bidding against a buyer who wants to hunt on it, a buyer who wants a place to build, a buyer who wants an inflation hedge that is not correlated with stocks, a buyer who wants a legacy asset for their grandchildren. USDA commentary on recent land value increases has pointed to development pressure, investor demand, and rural demographic trends as forces driving localized competition for land. None of those buyers need the land to produce $16 an acre, Several of them do not care whether it produces anything at all. So the working rancher, whose entire budget depends on what the grass can grow, is competing for the same acre against people whose valuation has nothing to do with grass. And in that contest, the person with a cash flow model always loses to the person with a preference. That is why the yield is under 1%. The price is not being set by the cattle. It is being set by everyone who wants the land, for reasons the cattle have nothing to do with. Now put a year on it, both ways. In the good scenario, you inherited or bought the land long ago, so the $4 million is not a cost you are servicing. Your equity is enormous. You run a tight calving season, keep weaning percentages high, and your cost per cow sits below regional average. Analysis of high-return operations consistently finds they wean meaningfully more pounds per exposed female than average producers, largely through a tighter calving window. In a strong market, you make a real income, and the land underneath you appreciates in the background. This is a genuinely excellent position, and it is the position almost every successful ranch is actually in. In the realistic scenario, you bought it. You borrowed against $4 million of land to generate $150,000 of gross return in the best cattle year anyone can remember. Your interest expense alone consumes most of it. A drought year arrives, and drought is not an exception in ranching. It is a recurring feature. Pasture fails, you buy hay at market prices, and feed is already the largest line in your operating budget. Your cost per cow spikes in exactly the year your grass disappeared. Meanwhile, the balance sheet is fine, better than fine. The land is worth more than when you bought it, and you cannot eat it. That is the position ranchers describe as asset-rich and cash-poor, and it is not a figure of speech. It is the arithmetic of owning a $4 million asset that yields under 1% while requiring full-time labor to maintain. Nothing burned down. Nobody made a bad decision. The cattle were healthy, the fences held, the calves sold at a historically strong price. You were just running a low-margin operating business on top of an asset the market had already priced for someone else. That is the whole thing in one line. Every other business we look at, the building is a cost you carry so the business can run. Here it is inverted. The business is the cost you carry so you can keep the land. Which is why the honest version of the question is not whether a ranch makes money. It is whether you can afford to hold it long enough for the only part that reliably pays to finally pay you. And the people who romanticize this life are not wrong about what it is. They are just wrong about which half of it is the asset. This video is general education about how an industry works, not business, financial, agricultural, or investment advice. If you want the real numbers, the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service publishes its annual land values and cash rent summaries free of charge, and USDA Economic Research Service publishes commodity cost and return estimates for cow-calf operations by region, also free.